Tonight we're going to talk mainly about a concept and an idea, and we'll start in the very opening of Proverbs in chapter 1. I had a wonderful teacher who taught both a combination of church history and church doctrine, and you could name any major subject, Christ, God, the Word, the church, or anything else. And he could start in the first century and every century up to today, then kind of describe to you, here were kind of the major thinkers, here was the trends, here's what happened. And it was just always amazing to be able to start with the New Testament and then the early church and just walk through all the way. But he had an expression that I always enjoyed, and he would talk for a while, and then he would say, now we're going to drive a stake down and walk around this idea for a while. And like I said, it could be anything from the nature of Christ, and especially into the 300s and the 400s, a lot of people were killed over where did Jesus have a body or not, which to us seems a little bit silly, but this whole thing about spirit or flesh and other things. And at a certain point, he would say, no, we're just going to drive a stake down, and we're going to walk around this for a while and just kind of let you think this through. And then just before he would finish, he would say, the knot in the thread. Okay, I don't know anything about sewing other than my mom and my wife are really good at it, but I understood the expression, if you don't have a knot in the thread, at some point it just pulls out. And after we had walked around an idea for a while, he'd say, now, the knot in the thread is, and what holds this together, and then he would talk and discuss that. Tonight we're going to look at the term, the fear of the Lord, and that's where we're going to try to drive the stake and walk around and just talk about a variety of different things. But the fear of the Lord, to my mind, is the knot in the thread that holds Job's, Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes together as wisdom literature. And if you've been here from the beginning, don't want to make you nauseous, but just always remember the books of poetry commend in poetical form what the law commands. And coming at it through metaphors, through descriptive terms and other things are very significant. And I'm always so appreciative of getting to do a class like this because you always just see something and learn something. And tonight, in fact, I was late doing some other stuff, and I come across the thought, and the guy said, have you ever noticed what the 7th verse in the first chapter of Proverbs is? And you stop and think, how important is 7 in Hebrew thought and in Hebrew teaching? And that's something I'll just always remember. These first 6 verses give us this introduction, and we hear these words of a feather that flock together. We're going to hear understanding, insight, knowledge, discernment, all these other things. And then you come to the 7th verse of the first chapter, and then here's our thread. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of, in this verse, knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so before we finish tonight, we're going to think of idioms like, for example, if you start a journey at some point, you get on a road or a path, and you take that first step toward that destination. If you're going into a house or a building, at some point, you come through a threshold, you come through a door to get into a building. And so at the very opening of Proverbs, then we're going to find out that opening step on the path or the way, that threshold that we cross. And remember, we looked last week about Lady Wisdom in chapter 9, 1-6. She has built a house on 7 pillars. She's prepared her meal. She's calling people to come in. Those of you who are simple, come and listen and learn. And she has built a house and calling people to come in and to learn in her house. Well, the fear of the Lord is that initial step on the path, or the fear of the Lord is going to be the threshold that walks us into the house. The one term tonight, central idea, the fear of the Lord is the nearest word for religion in the Old Testament. And it's interesting, some words that in our conversation, in our usage, are very common. And like, for example, even if you go through the New Testament, where do you hear the word religion? Oh, pure religion, undefiled before God the Father is this: visit the widows and fatherless in their affliction to keep yourself unspotted from the world. But as much as the word religion is used in a general context today, it's not used that frequently in Scripture, but a term like the fear of the Lord functions in our Scripture like the word religion functions for us today in English. And wisdom literature particularly, but we'll still stick with Proverbs, is going to be written in order to encourage men to fear the Lord. So I'm just going to read some samples, and we always have people listening in, so I'll just give you the verse. And we're not reading the whole verse, but just a little bit about the fear of the Lord. And what I want you to notice, and there's going to be 4 or 5 of them that we're not going to read, what I want you to notice is that from the first chapter, verse 7, literally to the next to the last verse in the book of Proverbs, there's this thread that runs all the way through, and you'll keep hearing in different times, in different ways, something about the fear of the Lord. So chapter 1 and verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And that's going to be, when you read different writers who've studied this for years, and I like the term that just came across the most frequent was, this is the motto for the book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and we'll come back to that. Chapter 129, and these will be said negatively and positively, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. And we're going to learn all kinds of little bitty different things about this, but the fear of the Lord is going to be a choice. Do you remember the expression in Luke chapter 7? The Pharisees and the teachers of the law rejected God's purpose for themselves because they rejected the baptism of John the Baptist. And they had the chance to hear what? Repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I wonder, being born as the children of Abraham, baptism was something for proselytes, especially Gentile proselytes. And I can see someone who feels like, well, I'm a father of Abraham. Why should I be baptized like some Gentile or some proselyte? But they rejected the purpose of God. And so we're going to find the fear of the Lord is something that also can be rejected. Chapter 2 and verse 5, you will understand the fear of the Lord, and you will find the knowledge of God. 8:13, the fear of the Lord is hatred of evil and knowledge of the Holy One, and that is insight. Give me half a second while I'm thinking about it. The very first opening in the book of Job, and no one in antiquity would think of this, but when I read about Job, I think of our car and utility batteries. They have a negative pole and a positive pole. And there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. He was blameless and upright. And there are 2 things that are said about him. 1, positively, he feared God. 2, negatively, he turned away from evil. And those are 2 ways of saying the same thing. By fearing God and walking that direction and that path, then he is also then at the same time going to turn away from evil. And that's something, like I said, is just going to be a thread that's going to run through this wisdom literature. In chapter 9 and verse 10, and we'll come back to this, this is an important verse, the beginning of wisdom and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight, and this is the fear of the Lord. 10:27, the fear of the Lord prolongs life. And let me just go ahead and repeat something that we said 2 or 3 weeks ago. When I read the Proverbs, I don't think of them in terms of just absolute truth. I do think of them in terms of eternal principles. And sometimes I have listened to people who've taken a proverb, like, for example, Train up a child in the way he should go, and what does the rest of it say? When he is old, he will what? Okay. I've talked with people who just beat themselves up mercilessly because we did everything we could, and my child has chosen to do something different. And that's something we've talked about in a different context. And you'll see those in different situations here in the book, and that it will be a principle of truth, but they're not necessarily to be taken just as a very, very rigid and specific, oh, this is a ironclad truth. 14:26, in the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence. And this is going to be a visual, 14:27. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may avoid the snares of death. 15:16. This sounds like some of us when we were newlyweds. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. I always enjoyed having classes with Brother McCord, and he normally got up at 4 o'clock, or ran 2 miles, did most of an hour in Hebrew and an hour in Greek, and then drove out and taught classes. But he came into class one day and he said, I have been in the presence of royalty this week. And as he talked about it, he had been in Tennessee, somewhere up in the hills, and a couple of families at different times had invited him to come eat with them, and everything they had in the house was homemade. Homemade table, the benches were sawed off smooth bits of log, and he said we had beanie weenies and crackers and water. And he said, I have been in the presence of royalty. I have been with the people of God this week. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than a house with feasting and treasure and strife that's in it. 15:33, the fear of the Lord is instruction in wisdom. By the fear of the Lord, 16:6, a man avoids evil. 19:23, the fear of the Lord leads to life, and he who has it rests satisfied. The reward, 22:4, for humility and the fear of the Lord is riches, honor, and life. And then 23:17, let not your heart envy sinners, but continue in the fear of the Lord all the day. Now, here is one of those threads, and I just want to talk through this, and we're going to come back and stay primarily in Proverbs. But when you look at this expression in wisdom literature, then both in Proverbs, and then you'll see it also in the book of Psalms, then the fear of the Lord is described as the beginning of wisdom. And like I said, you'll see it under number 1 there, Psalms 11 and 10. And this is, and I like the term, a motto for the book of Proverbs. It's also a reflective statement. And so when we come to the book of Job, just a little bit past the middle, in the middle of the book of Job, 28:28, we have another comment about the fear of the Lord. And then we start reading, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, the chasing after the wind. And you come to the end of Ecclesiastes, and what does Solomon say? Oh, the end of the whole matter has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. So what I'd like you to see kind of as a mental picture, do you see what I'm saying by a thread that runs through wisdom literature? So in Proverbs, and then also in Psalms 111 verse 10, oh, this is where you began. This is that first step. This is the importance of knowing and living with God. It's the beginning. It's going to be in the middle of Job when they're having all these different discussions. Yes, and the fear of the Lord is in the middle. And then we come to the book of Ecclesiastes. And so can I just say, using our terminology, in wisdom literature, the fear of the Lord is the A and the Z that kind of runs all the way through, and the thread that takes place. When you look at the fear of the Lord, and you'll see these terms, it's an invitation to modesty, it's an invitation to moral obedience, and it accepting a religious foundation for one's life. And recently had a picture of one of my aunt's tombstone, and trust in the Lord with all of your heart Do not rely on your own insights. And that was probably on her tombstone 20 years before she died. But she said, I want, if my children and my grandchildren ever come here, I want them to have a biblical principle to hold on to after they've come to visit. And so here's an example, number 2. When Abraham is willing to offer Isaac, then God says, now I know that you fear God. So the fear of the Lord produces obedience through trust in God's commandments. It's a unifying response to God's people. And you'll notice it's a part of the life of Joseph, of Job. And I especially love this one with the midwives. Do you remember they have orders from the Egyptians to do what? To kill the children. And because they feared God, they put their lives at risk by not following the orders that they had received. And like I said, you'll just notice it'll come up in just various places as you read through. All of them will share this quality. And then you'll find Israel at the Exodus, 1431, Moses' admonition, and the fear of the Lord is then this term that's used as the appropriate response to God. And you look at God, he saves, he delivers. And so here's a reminder, and Walter Kaiser made this note. The fear of the Lord is the source of wisdom that comes from God. The fear of God is the appropriate response to the promises of God. And you just stop and think, going all the way back to the garden, he will bruise your heel, he will bruise his head. Abraham, let's count the stars. And if you can count the stars, you can count your children. I'm going to give you descendants. I'm going to give you land. And through you, all the nations. So God makes all of these promises all the way through Scripture, and he continues to keep them. And the fear of the Lord is the appropriate human response to the promises of God. If you look on the back of that page, not only is the fear of the Lord something that is a thread through just the history. Remember when we talk about the prophets, we spell the word F-O-R-T-H. Isaiah will speak forth to the iniquity of his day. And then, guided by the Spirit, he will F-O-R-E, he will foretell things that are going to happen in the future. And listen what he says about the coming of the Messiah, which is going to be Jesus. And so 700 years before Jesus is born, then Isaiah says in chapter 11, 2 and 3 in the verse 5, the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding. And let me just stop. We're going to touch on this again Sunday night, Lord willing. Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, favor with God, favor with man. It wasn't just poured into him miraculously. It was a growing process that I maintain is generated especially by his mother and his father, earthly mother and father. But Jesus grew in wisdom. And so when you look at the coming of the Messiah, predicted 700 years, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. Verse 5, righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, faithfulness the belt of his loins. And just the comment, the fear of the Lord is essential to a right relationship with God. I didn't write this down, but this example came to mind. And again, Lord willing, we may look at this in a few weeks. What is the difference in the attitude of Saul in wanting to kill David, and in David in those two opportunities that he had to kill Saul? When you stop and think about it, both of them are the Lord's anointed, right? Samuel has anointed both of them, and twice David has the opportunity. Saul is vulnerable, whether he's in the cave or he's asleep, and here's this opportunity, and the guys with him are just saying, kill him, kill him, kill him. And what does David say? God forbid. I will not touch the Lord's anointed. Well, see, the action of not killing him comes from this respect, this fear of God and his teaching, and Saul totally neglects that in every stage of his life. And we don't know, and I'll look at this again when we come to it. He may have spent 15 to 20 years of his 40 years as king trying to find ways to catch it. He wasted all this time trying to catch David when he could be doing all these other things. But David, I will not touch the Lord's anointed. And that's what's going to be the product. This fear of the Lord causes us to have this respect. And then when we come to Jesus, I love this verse. I think it's John 8:29. I always do what pleases him. And you stop and think, as human beings, how different would my life be if just constantly I just keep thinking, I always do what pleases him. I mentioned this a couple of years ago. The first guy I worked with for 2 summers in Childress was a prince, a retired military sergeant. And you would never know he'd been anywhere near the military. He had this wonderful bedside manner and was just gracious and taught and helped and encouraged. And what a blessing to have 2 summers with him. Okay, ladies, don't stone me, but there was a time where the beehive hair thing was in. And if you look at church directories or something from the late 60s or 70s, I'm just going to stop there before I get any more trouble. But it was just kind of this, I'll just call it beehive. We had a lovely lady at church, and she had the beehive haircut, or whatever, however you want to call that. And he just asked her one day, he was pretty straightforward. He said, why on earth do you wear your hair that way? And she said, my John likes it that way. He said, oh, good. And as we talked about that, he said, I try to be really careful about making comments about people's appearance. But he said, she'd sure look a whole lot better if she took that thing down. But what did she say? Oh, my husband likes it that way. Well, you look at the life of Jesus. Lord, not my will, but your will be done. I always do what pleases him. And one of the echoes 700 years before about the coming of the Messiah is that the spirit of the knowledge and the fear of the Lord and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. I've been with a couple of people who are trying to do God's will by gritting their teeth and just, And isn't it easier when it's a delight? And even this concept that weaves through the Old Testament is something that's predicted of the coming of the Messiah, and example for us, an essential part of a right relationship with God. The words in English, respect alone isn't quite enough because of the gravity, and I'm sorry I missed the word of there. Fear is also appropriate, but just by itself can be an unhealthy dread. And when we think of the fear of the Lord, the object of this fear is the creator of all and the one who is sovereign over his creation. And those who experience fear in his presence know that their rightful place in the universe. And I like this, the word awe. I stand in awe of him. Awe is close in English if it's understood as the veneration, the acknowledgement of the sacred. And this is the attitude that is expressed in worship to the one true God. Where we lived in Midway City, we lived behind a hill on the east side, and it blocked out. We were 2 miles from Tinker Field. And at different times of the night, if I woke up, all of the city lights were kind of blocked out. And a couple of nights at 4 o'clock, I woke Sheila up and I says, you just need to come see this. And like, here's the Big Dipper standing up on edge, and then here's Orion coming over. And I just said, just stand here for a second and feel how tiny we are in view of the universe. I had a couple ladies in church said, it would not be good in our house if you woke me up at 4 o'clock in the morning to step outside and look at the stars. But every so often, I think it's healthy for us as the children of God just to stand back and think, and he said, and then here comes this magnificent universe he spoke into existence. You know, growing up at the edge of the Dust Bowl, I never get tired of being around the ocean. And 10, 20, 30 years from now, they can tell you exactly when high tide is going to be at this particular point. And here God speaks this into existence. And a part of this fear of the Lord is, and I'm later going to use the term qualitative difference. There's a sense that we always acknowledge God is God, and we are the created, and this fear of the Lord is, to me, this healthy spiritual approach to God, but he is always here, and we are the ones who are his children. Number 5, fearing God is primarily about relationship. It's not primarily a sense of terror or quaking. It is a sense of respect for who he is and all of his different attributes. And some people, again, coming in as new Christians, this would seem nearly like a contradiction because how much is said about love and the importance of love. But fearing God is not a barrier to coming to God. It's compatible with loving God. And in a sense, fearing God and loving God are identical when we understand creator and created. So, number 1, to stand in God, to fear God, I should say, is to stand in awe of him. We'll make a correction on that later. To fear God is to give reverence or honor to him. To fear God is to respect him or to regard him highly. And you look, there's all kinds of examples. Fear can be everything from master to slave, citizens to king, a child to the parents. A wife is to fear her husband. Jesus feared God. But the fear of God excels all of these earthly relationships because it's just our wholehearted acknowledgement to the nature of who he is. We're going to come to this in just a second, but let me just go ahead and mention it here. I think appropriate worship is a part of the appropriate response to understanding God. And just the blessing and the privilege of being able to worship. I sometimes watch the Field of Dreams for one scene. The reporter anticipating doing what? Going out into the cornfield. And I look at that, and yes, it's mythological and all this other stuff, but just the look of anticipation of what is this going to be like. Sorry, I'll just shake this down for a second. I try to imagine sometimes, okay, what is the figure of us walking on streets of gold? What does it mean to live in a city where the gates are never closed and they're the size of pearl? And as pearl is done by irritation here are gates of pearl that never close. Oh, the children of God will have the right to eat of the tree of life and to listen to the chorus, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And sometimes I just try to picture, what is that going to be like? We lived on 2 different farms, 1 to 6, and then from 6 to 12. And at the one from 6 to 12, we were 10 miles out of town. And it was a dirt road, but two paths. And I had a really nice tricycle, and sometimes I would sit at the house and look for a jet coming this way, and I would race him the quarter of a mile to the mailbox. And then you get to the mailbox and catch your breath, and you turn your tricycle around, and then you get to looking, and then you try to see a jet, and then I'm gonna race him to the house. And here I am, 7 or 8 years old, and what keeps coming to my mind is, I wonder where he's going. I have no idea, but I wonder where he's going. Having no idea of the hundreds and thousands of miles that I would someday be traveling halfway around the world, and sometimes walking down the ramp and getting ready to get on, I hear this little 7 or 8 year old voice saying, "Oh, I wonder where they're going. Hooray, we get to go on this one and we get to find out." And I think sometimes it would do all of us good to just, and I'm thinking about worship, that here we are on earth having the privilege to do with brothers and sisters or even by ourselves with what is simultaneously going on around the throne of God. And this sense of the fear of the Lord leads us to an attitude of respect and to worship and of awe. So when you look at number 6, the fear of the Lord is commended to man as the way in which God wants us to live. And he created the universe. There's no wisdom apart from a reverent relationship with God. Stand in awe, to reverence, to honor him, to respect him. And then the fruits of fearing God: keep his commandments, serve him, strive to do what's right. And then we've used this wonderful term already, to depart from evil. So if you look at the next page, I'm not going to go through all of these because of time, and I'll leave some of these for you to look at. But in 7:1, true religion is oftentimes equated and regarded with the fear of the Lord. And even in our New Testament, they are walking in the fear of the Lord. But, and this term is going to come up later, and I just want to go ahead and mention it so I don't forget it. What does the Hebrew writer says? It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And yes, perfect love casts out fear, and yes, we're to have this sense of being loved and cared for, and especially in our salvation. Having said that, a part of this respect is, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. If you look at number 8, the fear of the Lord is this foundation. And I found this very interesting. If you look kind of in that second or third paragraph, this is R.C. Ortland. In 2012, he did a Google search for books on self-esteem. You ready? 14,879 books were available on Google on self-esteem. What does that say about our society? We place the primary focus here, and who I am and what I'm doing and how I should feel. And the contrast to that, can I do the term inversion, the opposite? The fear of the Lord is given to us as the proper spiritual posture, and the fear of the Lord places the focus in whether you want to do it out there with God or better still up here with God. And yes, we are his sons and daughters, and all these other things are true, but look at the contrast between just looking at my life in terms of self-esteem, and I understand this, and it's so appropriate. I've heard some really good talks on self-love, and I don't quibble with all of them, but the thread that runs through these books is not primarily about us. The thread is primarily about God. And as the fear of the Lord is our call to be in that proper relationship. So I'm about halfway through the first paragraph under number 8. In Proverbs, wisdom begins by focusing first upwards on God, and this is my term, our vertical relationship with him then defines our relationship with self and our horizontal relationship with others. And I'm sorry, when I hear the word distill, I have very specific memories of this. My grandfather on my mom's side, so my great-grandfather, lived in Prestonburg, Kentucky, and in the early 1900s killed a man in a day when you kill one of us and we kill one of you. And they hid him for a week and got supplies together and decided Indian Territory would be a great place to go. And so when I went and visited my great-grandfather, I thought that those cylinders out in the chicken house had like chicken mash and chicken feed and other things. Oh no, he brought the homebrew family recipe with him from Kentucky, and he's making moonshine in the chicken house. And so when I hear the word distill, I always just have a very specific reaction to this. This guy wasn't meaning that at all, but I still had to laugh. If we distill the book of Proverbs into one thought, it would be, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So it's an openness, it's an eagerness to please Him, it is humility to be instructed by Him. And again, we've used these terms: turn away from evil, surrender to His will, love Him. And here's that verse from Hebrews, it's 10:31. All the time we keep remembering, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. When you look at terms like lifestyle and how people conduct themselves, in the book of Proverbs, the word path, like people walk along a path, is used 23 times. The word walk is used 17 times. And the word way is used 76 times. And look at what that talks about in terms of describing, and it's going to be a choice because oftentimes there are two ways, there are two paths that people have to choose from. But over and over and again, wisdom is this description. Okay, here is the path that leads one back to God, and that's the direction and the focus of one's life. Proverbs 3:6. In all of your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your path. So our first step on the path of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And I was looking at these terms we opened with. The threshold into the banquet of Lady Wisdom is the fear of the Lord and the knowledge of the Holy One. This is a short paragraph. C.S. Lewis wrote this wonderful little book called Mere Christianity. And I think it just kind of distills some of the thought and brings it together about the consequences. And I'm doing this with us having God at one place and ourselves as the creatures. In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people, and of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that's above you. Now, what an appropriate way to say that. And again, here's this posture, the fear of the Lord, that's so significant to our life and our lifestyle. Okay, we're on the back page, and we're going to be quitting a little bit, so well done. Way to hang in there. The fear of the Lord, as we mentioned, and I'll always remember this now, the 7th verse. And so as I open the book of Proverbs in the future, I'll think, chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord. And it's used frequently in terms of our awe before divinity and worship. And again, it's our term for religion. But I was thinking about this as well. In the book of Proverbs, the idea of life and living is very appropriate. And it's very similar to the book of John. These things are written in order that you may believe, and believing you may have life in His name. In Him were all things created. Without Him is not anything created that was created. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the Gospel of John just features life over and over and again. And I found this really helpful. As you read through Proverbs, then the call of Lady Wisdom and the call of Lady Folly to these two different lifestyles in chapters 1 through 9 is ultimately a call for us to the best possible life that we can have. So notice this in this is 9 verse 2, just 9 verse 2. This is a symbol, okay? But those who fear the Lord have access to the tree of life which Adam and Eve were driven from the garden. And here's a future lesson at some point. Genesis, because of sin, they're removed from the garden. And then here we are in the middle of the Old Testament, and we have these verses about a tree of life. And what's one of the closing pictures in the book of Revelation? Oh, the sons and daughters will have the right to partake of what Adam and Eve were denied, literally, in the Garden of Eden. And so here's symbolic terms in the poetry, but she is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her, and those who hold her fast are called blessed, Proverbs 3:18. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and whoever captures or wins souls is wise, Proverbs 11:30. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desired fulfilled is a tree of life, Proverbs 13:12. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit, Proverbs 15:4. We're not having time to do topical lessons in Proverbs, which there are so many, but there's an awful lot said about the tongue, and we'll just leave it at that. But as well, the fear of the Lord leads one to what's called the fountain of life. Tree of life, fountain of life. The teaching of the wise is a fountain of life. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. Good sense is a fountain of life who has it. The words of a man's mouth are deep waters. The fountain of wisdom is a bubbling brook. And look at these allusions to life, whether it is the echo from the original tree of life for those who fear the Lord in this world, and the fountain of life. So here's our closing thoughts. 1, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, kernel, core, heart, essence, and Ecclesiastes, the end of the matter. A wise man fears God, turns away from evil. And those are opposites, but they're also in tandem with each other. The fear of the Lord, as we've said, number 3, is the nearest equivalent for our term religion in the Old Testament. And this is something just through the years, I like the term God consciousness. How different is my life when, as I just go from day to day, I have a profound sense of God consciousness about the world around me and who I am and where I am in this particular world. Mary Chapin Carpenter, a beautiful Western singer, she was talking about one of her really good friends, and this was her friend's signature song. And when I heard this, I thought, these musical people are so involved in it, and it's such a big part of their lives. And she simply said, I would love to inhabit that song, and I would love for that song to come from my heart and from under my skin. And I thought, wouldn't that be a wonderful description of us if the fear of the Lord was coming from our heart and came from under our skin? Eddie Clower's son, Steve, has now been asked to go back to Memphis, and our son was with him a few years ago when they were students. And Eddie Clower does the publishing, and this is his son. And Steve went to Fort Worth for a number of years and did a great work with the church. But my son simply said this. He said, Dad, he said, we all try to be godly. But he said, partly because of nature and personality and training, Steve Clower just is godly from the inside out. He doesn't try to be godly. He's just godly from the inside out. And you stop and think, could this principle of the fear of the Lord be something that is just so much a part of us that it comes from our heart and from under our skin? And it's a perspective. It's a stance in life. It's a paradigm. This is how things work. And it is a willingness and a seeking to live by God's principles. And I thought, what an appropriate way to end 28:14. Blessed, happy is the one who fears the Lord always. God bless.